We are very pleased to be joined now from Washington by the president of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, Dan Stein. Dan, thank you for checking in from Newsmax, Washington. We have been chronicling the fact that this whole question of illegal immigration has been blurred, in part by the dominant media culture and the alphabet networks who refuse to make the distinction between illegal immigrants and those who come here legally, but also by our president, who now says we need to have all the refugees we can have. In fact, issuing a statement on this Islamic holiday to invite more people in. And indeed, as I was mentioning earlier, the fact is, as I understand it, a little less than 12,000, quote, refugees from Syria, less than 0.5% of those refugees admitted to the United States thus far are Christian. When you think about what is going on in terms of the efforts of ISIS to kill Christians in the Middle East these days, your thoughts on this whole notion of, quote, refugees, and where Donald Trump has pointed out that we should have, quote, extreme vetting of those refugees?
Well, Donald Trump has made the point, JD, and it's good to be with you. He's made the point, look, if you can't vet people properly, then you shouldn't admit them. And it's really important. The media need to be spending more time drilling down on Hillary Clinton's policies and take a look at how they contrast with Donald Trump's. Hillary Clinton has a policy that basically is more radical and extreme than Barack Obama's, in the sense that she says not only can anybody will never have to leave once they come, however they come, legally, illegally, doesn't matter. Talk about blurring the distinction. She's also basically saying, I'm going to ramp up dramatically the number of refugees and so-called refugee admissions and bend the law and creatively take control from Congress of who can come in and who won't. And it's a very serious constitutional crisis. Now, folks need to go back and listen very carefully to Donald Trump's speech, August 31st, where he talked about immigration in Phoenix. He gave a very complete rundown of his platform positions. He even went further and talked about decreasing legal immigration to what he called more traditional levels. Many of the things Donald Trump is talking about mirror many of the things FAIR's been talking about for some time. And really, Americans need to understand you have a very stark choice in this election. There are two very different paths. Hillary Clinton's path would give us maybe 80 million more people in this country by the end of the century. Donald Trump's path would actually maybe stabilize population growth, and we would see our country be able to restore credibility to who comes in.
Dan, you mentioned Donald Trump. Let's listen again to the GOP nominee in his own words on illegal immigration.
Homeland Security and the Department of Justice to begin a comprehensive review of these cases in order to develop a list of regions and countries from which immigration must be suspended until proven and effective vetting mechanisms can be put in place. I call it extreme vetting.
There is the call once again from that Arizona immigration speech, extreme vetting. Pollsters tell political candidates to avoid the word extreme. But in this case, I think the body politic understands what Mr. Trump is talking about. 20 seconds for your response to that, Dan.
Well, look, we know, JD, that FBI Director James Comey said that under the current vetting, he said the national security can't be guaranteed and public safety is potentially under threat. James Comey still has a lot of credibility in most public policy areas. If he says the vetting is not secure, who are we to argue? Basically, Trump's he's on to something, right?
And we are on to something. That is our break. We will step aside and come back. More with Dan Stein and more of your calls at 1-877-Newsmax. It's America Talks Live, Hour 2, and we'll see you on the other side of the break.
Millions of people go into Germany. The crime is unbelievable. The problems they're having is unbelievable. And Hillary Clinton wants to be the Merkel of the United States. Okay? I don't think so. I don't think it's going to happen.
Welcome back to America Talks Live Part 2, where the most important person is you. Your calls and comments at 1-877-Newsmax. That's 1-877-639-7629. You heard Donald Trump again from earlier this month at a town hall meeting saying that his opponent, Hillary Clinton, wants to be the Angela Merkel of the United States. Frau Merkel, of course, with a healthy dose of political trouble at home in Germany. And to stop and think about that, the elites so happy with her open borders, Time magazine made her the person of the year less than a year ago, and now Frau Merkel may face political extinction at home. Something worth noting, and time for us to continue our conversation as we're rejoined by the president of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, or FAIR is the acronym, Dan Stein. Dan joins us from Newsmax Washington, and again, we invite your calls at 1-877-NEWSMAX. That's 1-877-639-7629. Dan, before the break, we were chronicling President Obama's call for refugees to continue to come to the United States, even as we noted those refugees in all likelihood not properly vetted from Syria. When you check the numbers right now, less than 0.5% are Christians fleeing persecution from the Middle East, and that persecution at the hands of ISIS. But there is another story about Mexico. Now, it's true that Donald Trump went there to great accolades, visiting with the president of Mexico, but as we understand it now, Mexico is issuing transit visas to Africans from known terror nations. So apparently, and this is even the New York Times with the article, Mexico not being much of a neighbor if they're sending entry visas to potential terrorists to come across our southern border. What's your understanding of all of this?
Well, look, the basic problem here is that we have policies that are being manipulated, and Mexico is not helping anything at all. Our asylum law is supposed to be reserved for people who come here legally and as a result of changed circumstances cannot go back home, say a coup or something. What's going on now is international smugglers have figured out that you can make an asylum claim after entering illegally. So, not surprisingly, people from Africa are being smuggled into places like Mexico. The Mexican government, knowing full well they're going to go to the U.S. illegally, has them coming in. They give them these little transit visas for several weeks so they can find their way to the U.S. border. And the next thing you know, they're here making an asylum claim. Now, that's different than a refugee claim. An asylum claim gets treated differently. There's a lot more procedural process. So an alien gets a big advantage, JD, by getting inside the U.S. first to make the asylum claim. And FAIR has argued for years that if an alien is, forum shopping, like stopping through 3 or 4 safe countries on the way here, they can't be a true refugee. A refugee is supposed to be in life-threatening situation, willing to take safety wherever he or she can get it. Not saying, the UK looks nice, US looks nice, I'll pass through 18 countries until I get where I want to go. And it's our policies, and just like it's been Germany's policies, that have been manipulated and have created the crisis. Mexico obviously is not helping the situation at all.
Let's go to our phones at 1-877-NEWSMAX, 1-877-639-7629. From the borough of Brooklyn in New York, Lorna is on the line. Lorna, welcome to America Talks Live. Thank you for calling in. What's on your mind?
Oh, what's on my mind is that people in certain position and certain stature don't really understand the situation or have not really been in it to see what's going on with refugees and things like that. For instance, when the Russians came to, I'm in Brooklyn, as I said, came here, they were given green cards, as they call them, permanent residents. They came in and they cost us a copious amount of monies. They had triple, quadruple bypasses. They got a house, they got apartment, they got food, they got clothes.
So, in other words, what you're telling us is that people come here and they scam the system.
What I'm saying that we are speaking about a certain subgroup of people, and and not about what has really happened and who was able to get in and why.
Well, let us
Some are
disabuse you of the
trying to
notion
get
if we are singling out one group. You mentioned Russians. I think
You're
indeed.
that's the reason why. Because
Well,
you
I'm so glad you
singled out
did. And I can tell you that there are
group.
sizable numbers of Chinese trying to get into the country, and there are sizable numbers of nationalities from across the globe. But pressing right now, when our commander-in-chief issues a specific invitation to refugees from the Middle East, and when we see what has happened there, that is why it is the news hook. It does not invalidate your comments, Lorna, and we appreciate you adding that to the public record here on America Talks Live. That is part of what this is all about. So I would not contest Lorna's point about Russians and others who have come in and, quote, gamed our system. This is not hostility directed at Mexicans, Africans, anybody. As I said, Dan, when I was on Capitol Hill, I don't care if you're from Ireland or Iceland. I don't care if you're from Mexico or Mauritania. If you're trying to pull a scam on the American people in terms of immigration law, you ought to be stopped.
Well, JD, you know, the point here is that refugee admissions are very political, and what decisions are made are often subject to the pressures or whims of an administration. And the more important point is refugee admissions are very, very expensive. They get fast-track treatment, all the benefits and special add-ons. It is much more economical and beneficial for the American taxpayer if we work to help refugees where they are, protect them where they are for eventual repatriation back to their home country. Resettlement in this country should only be an option of last resort and only after every other conceivable alternative has been considered.
And you are correct that we are playing fast and loose with the definition of refugees. Our caller, Lorna, making mention of the Russians. Indeed, after the prolonged period of the Cold War and an estrangement with the former Soviet Union, there may have been a more indulgent attitude toward Russian refugees at the time. Indeed, we could remember back 4 decades to the problems in Cuba and a massive influx of, in my view, legitimate refugees coming from Cuba. But it is very different from what we are seeing now. In Central America, for example, the designation of, quote, refugees from nations where there is not jeopardy, there is not war, there is simply an economic system that fails to live up to being able to provide jobs for citizenry. And thus you see this rather elastic definition of just exactly who is a refugee under the current administration. There's something else going on, Dan. With the 2 minutes we have left, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up. Your legislative update laments the fact that more qualified Americans are losing their jobs through H-1B outsourcing. Very briefly, describe the nature of this problem and this disconnect with official Washington and everyday Americans.
Well, the H-1B program, which goes back to 1990, has been increasingly abused by American corporations who bring in foreign workers and then require American workers to train their own replacements, right? It's like basically taking yourself to the gallows. And in many cases, these H-1B workers are then used to outsource technology. So the whole concept of the H-1B program, which was temporary, short-term, unforeseeable shortages, has now turned into a program to basically displace American workers wholesale. And at a time when we've outsourced so many manufacturing jobs, we're seeing the way H-1B workers are not only displacing Americans in our own country, but being used to outsource and steal technology as well.
We saw rather tearful and eloquent testimony from a STEM worker, a technology mathematics worker, someone in the computer industry who was employed at Disney World and forced to train his own replacement for some meager salary while he turned over his job to someone who came in at a lower wage. And this kind of war being waged on American workers, courtesy of the H-1B program, is something that I certainly have rethought in my days since serving in Congress. And just candidly, Dan, I think it was a huge mistake we made listening to the siren song of Silicon Valley, because the facts don't comport with the arguments offered by the internet titans who claim they need this cheaper labor coming into the United States. Dan Stein from the Federation for American Immigration Reform. This afternoon from Newsmax Washington. Dan, as always, we appreciate your insights and analysis here on Newsmax TV. Now, When we come back, Diamond and Silk react to the NFL players who chose to protest our national anthem by kneeling on the sidelines. It's our prime playback from last night's Newsmax Prime, and we will have more of your calls and comments later in the program. Appreciated that spirited exchange with Lorna at 1-877-NEWSMAX. All that and more coming up on America Talks Live.